In the last few lessons, we covered a lot of concepts about Redux because Redux is a very conceptual paradigm of how to build your application. And of course, we are definitely in this lesson going to set up our code to have Redux inside of it. But before I do, there's one more thing I want to cover. Now, the reason I want to cover this is because we're going to write a lot of code just to set up Redux. And it's a lot of new concepts and code that you might not understand. But if you at least understand from a high level what we're doing, you can see why we have to configure the code the way that we do. So looking back at this diagram of how our actions flow through Redux in order to trigger changes inside of our DOM, we look at this flow of events. We have some action that goes into our reducer, right, our root reducer, which then propagates changes into it, which update our store, and then our store finally results in DOM changes in the right components. Along the way of these actions occurring, before it ever even hits the root reducer, it can hit something in the middle called a middleware. And all a middleware is a piece of code that gets the action before the root reducer. What that middleware does with the actual action is entirely up to the middleware, but that's all it is. They're just something that receive these action objects before they reach the root reducer. Now, we're going to explore a lot of middlewares throughout this course, but the most important one that we're actually going to use and explore in order for us to better understand Redux is the Redux logger middleware. And all that middleware does is it logs out actions that get fired and then what the state of these reducers are before and after the action. So pretty much just a visual representation of what it is that actions do, which is very useful for us to understand Redux. So let's actually write this out in the code. So if we go back to our terminal, we need to actually install both Redux as well as the Redux bindings for React, because Redux can be used in multiple frameworks, not just React. And we also need that Redux logger middleware. So what we're going to do is we're going to say yarn add Redux space Redux logger and React Redux. So those are the three libraries that we need. So as those are being added to our application, let's go back to our application and go into our index.js file. Our index.js file is where we are actually going to put the new component that we get from React Redux that will give our application access to not only the store, but also those reducers that we're going to also write. Now, that thing that we get is going to be called the provider. And the provider is a component that we get from React Redux. This provider is a component that we want to wrap around the entire application because we want everything inside to have access to this store object that we get from Redux. So we'll actually write the store object, but first, let's just understand this provider. This provider is a component that is the parent of everything inside of our application. And as the parent, it allows us to get access to all of the things related to the store that we're going to put all of the actual code we want to store on our Redux state. So that's all this provider is. And it's a component, and it's got to be the parent of everything. So now that we have our provider, we actually need to write the store itself. Now, how we're going to do that is we are going to make a new folder inside of our source called Redux. And inside of here will be all the code related to our Redux that we're going to write. So what we want to write first is actually this root reducer. And what the root reducer is the actual base reducer object that represents all of the state of our application. So this root reducer will end up being the actual code that combines all of our other states together. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, if we wrote all of the code related to all the states in our application in one file, you can imagine that it becomes really unwieldy. So what we want to do is break the code up into its individual sections. And I'll show you how we'll do that, but just understand that all of the reducers that we're going to write is going to go into this root reducer. Now, the other thing that we're going to write is actually going to be the user reducer, because the user reducer is going to be that reducer that will store the state of our current user. Now, right now, we do store our current user inside of our app state. So we just want to move that into a reducer that is pretty much going to be the same type of object. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a new folder called user, and any Redux code related to this user is going to go into this folder. And the first thing we're going to make is that user reducer. And we're just going to say it's user.reducer.jsx, and this lets us know that this file is a reducer. Now, a reducer is actually just a function that gets two properties. It gets a state object, which represents the last state or an initial state, right? Which is just an object that represents what it is that we're trying to store. And then it receives an action. That action is just an object that has a type, which is a string value. So it's just a name that tells us what specific action this is. And when I say specific, it literally means like we are going to write a bunch of actions. We're going to name them whatever it is that we want. So we want to make sure that our reducers are aware of what specific type of action that's coming through is. And it's going to be based off this type property. The other thing it's going to have, which it might or might not, is something called a payload. Now, this payload can be anything. And the only reason that we can say it's anything is because maybe with this payload object, we want to do something with it in order to update our state. We might pass an object that we literally set as the value in our state, or we might use this value to make some transformations on our state. We don't know, but it's just a very flexible property that we get on this action object that we can or cannot use. Now, that's all actions are. They're just objects that have these two properties of type and payload. And this will make more sense once we write more of the code. But as I was mentioning before, our reducer is just going to be this function. So I want to call it user reducer because that's what it is. And it's a function that again gets the state and some action. Now, again, the state is going to be something that the Redux store is going to pass to this reducer, right, whenever an action fires. And the state will be whatever the state it is currently when that action gets fired. So because when we actually fire the state for the first time, it's going to be nothing, right? Because Redux doesn't know that we have any state when the app first initializes. So when an action gets fired, there's going to be no state. So we want to make sure to set an initial state. So what we'll do is we will write a new const called initial state. And this will just be an object that represents the initial state of this reducer. Very similar to when we instantiate state on our class components, right? We make sure to set some initial state value, which is the default values when this component mounts for the first time. And we're doing pretty much the exact same thing in our reducer. So we're actually going to take this current user value and put it into our initial state because it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing. So now that we have our initial state, we're going to make sure that inside of this function call, we're going to use that initial value as what is called a default parameter value. So this is an ES6 feature for functions where you can actually pass some default value here with this equals and then the value syntax. What this means is that if state is ever undefined, meaning that it's not set, then it will fall back and leverage this initial state value that we passed here. But remember, null is considered a value. So if this value inside when you use this default parameter is ever null, like as in state is ever null, it will still pass null in as the state value and consider it an actual valid value. And it won't fall back on this default value that we set. So this is just the thing we got to keep in mind. But now that we have our reducer function written inside of this, we have to actually think about how do we return the actual state we want based on the action. So what we're going to do here is we are going to write what's called a switch statement. And a switch statement is pretty much just this statement that looks like this based on some condition. And then inside of it, we set up case statements and a default value. So it's actually very simple. What we're going to say is that based on the action.type value, which will be a string, if the case of that action type is one that we want, right, then what we'll do is we'll render something. Otherwise, by default, we are going to just return the state. Now, the caveat here to remember is that every single reducer gets every single action that ever gets fired, even if those actions are not related to this reducer. So the reason why we want to default return the state is because if none of the action types match inside of the switch statement about the ones that we care about, then we just want to return the state. So for us, the case that we care about is set current user. Whenever set current user is the action type that gets fired, we then want to return a new object, which represents the new state that our user reducer is going to transform into. And what that value will be is everything else on the state. We always want to spread in everything on the state, right? Because we only want to modify the values that we care about. And the value that we care to set is our current user. And this is going to be the payload. And that's all it is. You remember how I said the action object is just a type and then a payload? Well, for us, we're literally setting the current user value with this payload. So this reducer, I know, might be a lot of new concepts that you're not used to. But if you just look at this statement, it's a function that gets a state object and an action. Depending on what the type of action is, this switch statement will then check if the case for this action type is equal to set current user, then I want to return this new object out of this reducer function. If none of these action types match any of the case statements that we write, then just default to return the current state of what the reducer is. So that's pretty much all our reducer code is. What we'll do is we will export this out as the default value from this user reducer. And then what we'll do is we will bring this into our root reducer, because now we have our reducer, our first reducer. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the root reducer represents the overall reducer based on all of the reducers that it pulls in. In order for us to combine them all together, we actually need to import this function called combine reducers. And this comes from the Redux library. So with this, when we import our user reducer from our new user reducer file, we are going to export out this as the default value, which gets returned from combine reducers, passing in this object where the key goes to the actual reducer that we want. So if you remember, our full state in Redux is just one big JSON object. The keys that represent the individual slices of state, i.e. the actual reducers, is the actual individual reducers that we've wrote. So this user reducer is just currently this object with a current user value that will get set whenever the set current user action fires. We are then pulling that into this combine reducers, which will return it into one giant object that is appropriately bound with all the Redux functionality that we want. So I know it seems complex. I know there's a lot of code that we wrote, but this is what we need in order to get started. So with this, we've written our first reducer, but we still have to actually bring it into our store and instantiate our store. Well, how do we do that? Well, this video is a little long, so I'm going to end it here, but in the next section, we're going to bring our new root reducer into our store, as well as create some other stuff, such as actions, so that we can actually flesh out the first Redux feature inside of our application. So I'll see you in the next lesson.